So welcome to everyone on the webinar today. Thank you for taking the time to attend. I'd like to note the importance of International Women's Day today and highlight the amazing women we have in our residential construction industry. My name is Lisa Lacey. I'm a member of CHBA Fraser Valley and thankful to be here today. Before we start, CHBA BC gratefully acknowledges that our staff and members live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional and ancestral homes of hundreds of Indigenous people and nations across British Columbia, each with their own unique traditions, history, and culture. We are honored to be on their lands. Housekeeping, we request that everyone keep their video and audio off for the presentation. Please do feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A or chat box. We will not be tackling single issue topics on this webinar, but all questions will be shared with ALC, and we ask that we all remain respectful. At the end of the presentation, I will help go through some of the questions as time permits. There will be a follow-up email to the presentation, including a link to the recording and recent relevant bulletins and details from the ALC. I'm very thankful to have Liz Sariaglu, Director of Policy and Planning, and Katerina Glavis, Senior Agrologist and Soils Team Lead here with us today. We had a sneak peek of their presentation yesterday, and we're so thankful for the opportunity to be here today. Please welcome Liz to start off.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Lisa. My name is Liz Sariaglu, and I'm the Director of Policy and Planning at the Agricultural Land Commission, and I'm joined by my colleague, Katerina Glavis, who is the ALC's Senior Agrologist and the ALC's Team Lead for the Notice of Intent team. So we're happy to be here today talking with all of you about home building and housing in the ALR. We had a great chat with CHBA yesterday, and I think we've really found some common ground on wanting to find ways to help facilitate and streamline housing in the ALR for all of you that are doing construction. So I come to you today with that intent. So we hope that by the end of today's session, you'll know a bit more about housing rules in the ALR, when to seek ALC authorization, and to learn a bit more how to navigate and streamline the ALC process. One moment. So to start off, the ALC was established between 1972 and 1973 in response to a major loss of farmland that was happening in BC at a rate of about 6,000 acres per year. So the ALC is an independent tribunal, and it's comprised of commissioners who are the decision makers, and they are experts in agriculture, local government, First Nation governments, as well as land use planning. And they've been appointed on behalf of government to make decisions with respect to land use of the agricultural land reserve. So the commissioners are supported by staff like Katerina and myself, and perhaps this is a good time to explain why you have Katerina and I here chatting with you today. When it comes to housing in the ALR, the ALC sort of has two sides of the shop when it comes to housing. One side of the shop, which is the department that I'm in, is policy and planning. And our team is responsible for interpretation of the legislation, developing policy and applications that have to do with housing structures in the ALR. Then we also have Katerina's side of the shop, which is the Notice of Intent team, which is all things that have to do with soil and fill that's needed in order to construct those residences. So as we go through today, if you have questions and you want to follow up, Katerina and I are your contacts, and we'll have our personal contact information at the end of the presentation for you. So the Agricultural Land Commission is responsible for carrying out the mandate of the Agricultural Land Commission Act, or I may refer to it as the ALC Act or the ALCA through the presentation. And perhaps something of interest that some people may not know, so the ALC does not actually write its own legislation and can't change the ALC Act or its rules. We are given the act and the legislation and the regulations from the Ministry of Agriculture, and it's our responsibility to interpret them and operationalize them. With that, we're going to talk a little bit about the Agricultural Land Reserve. So the ALCA established the Agricultural Land Reserve, which is the physical land base on which agriculture takes place in BC. As you can see from the map, the Agricultural Land Reserve takes place mostly in the valley bottoms around BC, and it's these valley bottoms that are often BC's most productive and most valuable agricultural land. And at the same time, they are also the areas where people most likely want to do settlements and do development. So this gives a bit of a geographic context to the discussion we're going to have today about this small area of BC around 5% of the province's land base on which people are looking to do agriculture and reside. Perhaps a somewhat interesting fact about the ALR is that although it comprises about 5% of BC's land base, about half of that is in Crown land and the other half is fee simple. So really what we're talking about is about 2.5% of BC's land base where we have this sort of mix of agriculture and residential uses taking place. So one question we often get asked is, why is housing in the ALR even regulated, or why does the ALC even have any sort of stake in the game when it comes to housing in the ALR? And one thing to note is that between 1973 and early February 2019 is that there were no restrictions on house sizes in the ALR whatsoever. Also, during that time, local governments or First Nation governments could allow more than one residence if they deemed it to be necessary for farm use. Some local governments took this on and had good policies around determining when a house was necessary for farm use. Some did not. Some preferred that the ALC made that decision. So there was a lot of variety in that determination. So what we saw at that time was a real proliferation of mega mansions in the ALR and multiple houses being constructed on farmland that may or may not have had a direct relation to agriculture. So we ended up with houses that looked a little bit like this and like this on farmland. So to address that, in February 2019, Bill 52 was passed, and now Bill 52 has changed the ALC Act and has amended it in order to put a cap on the maximum house size that you can have and put a cap on the number of residences that you can have in the ALR. And we're going to go all through that in a moment. So now, moving forward, we have maximum number of houses you can have and capping a size on each of those houses. So in answer to the question of why is housing in the ALR regulated, really what it boils down to is the ALC is interested in keeping farmland affordable and available for future farmers. So as it stands today, the ALCA and its regulations, ALR use regulation, allow up to 3 residences in the ALR that you can have for free from the ALC without needing to ask for permission. One note, though, is that sometimes a local government or First Nation government can put some restrictions on the size of these residences, or they could prohibit some of these. But when it comes to the ALC, you get 3 residential units for free. So the first is a principal residence, and a principal residence can be up to 500 meters squared in total floor area. And I'm going to talk about total floor area in a moment and go through that definition because it warrants its own discussion. The second sort of free residential unit you can have in the ALR is a suite within that principal residence. And then the third one, which is quite new as of late 2021 and early 2022, is an additional residence. So it's worth sort of mentioning that when the additional residence was introduced into the ALR use regulation, the intention of it was to be a small accessory residential unit, not to be a second full house. So it's accessory, meaning that it is smaller and subordinate to the principal residence. So when it comes to these additional residences, there's 2 sizes you could have, and it depends on the size of the parcel that you're dealing with. So if you have a parcel that's 40 hectares or less, you can have up to a 90 square meter additional residence. Or if you have a parcel that's over 40 hectares, you can have an additional residence that's up to 186 meters squared. And again, we're going to go over what that total floor area entails in just a moment. Lastly, before we leave the slide, I did just want to mention that although these residences are permitted outright and they don't require any approval from the commission, they do require, in the case of the additional residences, some authorization to place fill in order to construct these, and Katarina is going to go over that in more detail. So first, let's talk about the total floor area and what that means for a principal residence. So I do want to point out that when Bill 52 changed the Act and introduced this cap of 500 meters square, the legislation didn't necessarily say how we were to measure this. And so the commission had to come up with its own definition. And this was done by looking at other total floor area definitions of local governments around the province. So some background research was done in order to develop this. So the definition tries to balance the intent of avoiding those mega mansions in the ALR, but still provide the opportunity for what would be sort of normal residential uses that people might expect. So my asterisk on TFA at the top in the title there is to draw your attention to the ALC Information Bulletin 5, which is residential uses in the ALR, and we're going to share this with you afterwards. Has the full definition of what a principal residence is, and it's quite detailed. So for the sake of this conversation today, I'm just going over the high level elements of it. So first, the principal residence total floor area is measured to the outer surface of the exterior walls, which you'll see differs from the additional residence in a moment. So to the outer surface exterior walls, it includes enclosed balconies, includes porches and verandas, but it excludes attics, so long as those attics can't later be converted to more living space or more floor area, as well as it excludes basements and crawl spaces, so long as the basement is not larger than the main floors. So you can't make your basement twice the size as the width of your house. In addition, you can also have up to a 42 square meter garage, which is excluded from the total floor area. And we see that quite a bit. So what that means on the ground is that you can have your 500 square meter house and have an attached 42 square meter garage. So cumulatively, that's 542 square meters, and that's okay. And again, the basements are excluded. So recognizing that some areas of the province, you can have a basement, and other areas of the province, you can't. But for areas that you can, it actually gives you quite a bit of extra living space as well. So when it comes to building a principal residence, what you also get with it for free from the ALC is up to 1,000 square meters of fill in order to construct that principal residence. So that 1,000 square meters of fill could be combined to include the fill area for the actual house, for the driveway, and any landscaped areas around the house. Now, the ALR use regulation does not specify a depth of fill because it recognizes that in different locations around the province, you may have different requirements for floodplain heights. So long as you're filling to your floodplain height and not building something excessive like a mountain with a little house on top of it, you're going to be fine and you're not going to need any authorizations from the ALC. So next, we're going to talk about total floor area for an additional residence. And because the additional residence is kind of new as of late 2021 and early 2022, the definition for this is new as well. And before I get into this, again, I think it's good to reiterate that the intention of the additional residence was to be a small accessory residential unit. So some of you that may be doing some work in the ALR may have noted that the total floor area definition that we have for these accessory residences or additional residences has been adjusted from time to time since late 2021. And this is in part because the ALC needs to refine this definition to ensure that the residences were meeting the intention of being an accessory residential use and weren't accidentally expanding into something larger. So again, I note that the ALC's definition for total floor area is in our information bulletin, and it's quite long and it's quite extensive. So we're going to have a look at two examples of how total floor area can be used on two different types of additional residences. So the first, we're going to look at an example of this one, which would be sort of a simple garden suite type structure. So in this case, the additional residence is measured to the inner surface of the exterior walls. And this was a little tweak that was made to the definition. And this was done purposefully because this is generally how prefabricated structures are usually measured. And we didn't want to inadvertently measure in a way that would have a 90 square meter additional residence fall outside of the total floor area by a few inches. And that happened. And in response to that, we modified the definition so that now those prefabricated structures safely fall within the 90 meters squared or the 186 meters squared. In terms of what is included and excluded for an additional residence, we're going to include the enclosed and partially enclosed balconies, enclosed porches and verandas. If there's a basement, that is included in the total floor area because the additional residence is not contemplated to have a basement, as well as any attached garages that are intended for the use by the additional residence and unenclosed carports. Again, just like the principal residence, the attics are excluded so long as they can't be converted into into more living space, and crawl spaces are excluded. And again, basements are included. So next, we're going to have a look at a different type of additional residence and how the total floor area definition might apply. So Another common type of additional residence that we see is a carriage house. And I want to pause to explain that the ALR use regulation does not expressly permit a carriage house as an additional residence in the ALR. It just says a residence. So it doesn't contemplate the idea of having an additional residence above a garage or combined with any other building. That being said, the commission understands that this is pretty common, and so we made another refinement of the total floor area definition to accommodate this. So again, the idea behind a carriage house in the ALR is that it is above the garage that is intended for the principal residence. So the example we have here is a pretty straightforward example of a carriage house, which wouldn't cause much issue if it came across the ALC's desk. So in this case, the additional residence is on the second story of a one-story garage. The garage is for the storage and parking of vehicles for the principal residence. The garage is one large space that's accessed by garage doors. The garage is located on the first floor, and it's not any larger than the residence that is above it. And there's no internal connection between the garage and the additional residence. And the reason we are concerned about that and look for that in design is that we look to make sure there isn't a risk that there's an internal connection and that the garage may be converted into living space as well, which would then put the residence into non-compliance by exceeding the total floor area. So the additional residence, in this case, we can't really see where the principal residence is, but for purposes of this exercise, we're going to assume that it is clustered nice and close to the principal residence so that it makes it clear that that garage is intended for the principal residence. So there's no fill permitted outright for additional residences like there is in the case for principal residence. So anytime that somebody wants to construct an additional residence, there's going to be a need to come to the ALC through a notice of intent in order to request fill for that authorization. So I think sort of the big question that we often get asked, and many of you may be wondering, is can you avoid the ALC for housing in the ALR? And the answer is sometimes. And we have one specific case that I want to talk about where you really don't need to come to the ALC at all to seek authorization or approval. It's kind of a combination of things we've talked about already. So if a landowner wants to construct a principal residence that doesn't exceed the 500 meter square total floor area, and if the amount of fill that they need to use to accomplish that does not exceed 1,000 square meters of fill, the landowner can go ahead and proceed and just needs to deal with the local government and any other authorities that they might need to do that. As well, if a landowner wants to renovate or expand their principal residence and that renovation or expansion does not exceed the 500 square meters, again, the ALC has no involvement there. So say, for example, you had a 300 square meter home and you wanted to put an addition on it to make it 400 square meters, you would only be dealing with your local government and other authorities. So we've talked about the one circumstance where you don't need anything from the ALC. So now we're going to get into the scenarios where you do need to come to the ALC to connect with us for some sort of authorization or approval. So the first is our most simple process, which is a notice of intent, or we call it an NOI. So this is a streamlined process where a landowner will notify the ALC that they would like to place fill for a permitted use in the ALR that isn't afforded fill otherwise. So in this case, we're talking about residential uses. So the NOI process can take up to 60 calendar days, but it's worth noting that that timeline can be stopped and the clock can be restarted if the ALC requires more information from the landowner or the agent. So with that, that's sort of my first tip, is that the more fulsome the information that we can get through a notice of intent or later through an application, the easier it is for us to understand the proposal and the less back and forth we need to do, and the faster the application will go. We do sometimes see applications that are quite sparse, and that immediately triggers phone calls and emails to better understand the proposal. So next, if a landowner wants to request a non-permitted residential use, they move into the territory of an application. And these applications are called non-adhering residential use, or we just call them a NARU because it's a bit of a mouthful. And so this is the type of application that a landowner would seek if they wanted to do a type of housing unit that is not permitted outright in the ALR. So this might be if they wanted to do a house that's larger than 500, or if they wanted to have an additional residence that's larger than what's permitted on their parcel size, so that 90 or 186. So the NARU application can take up to 90 business day process. Sometimes it takes less, and sometimes it can take longer, just depending on the complexity of the application. And some of you may be wondering, why is one calendar day and why is one business day? And the reason for that is that the notice of intent is baked into our legislation, and it is prescribed 60 days, and anything in legislation is a calendar day. We don't have a legislated timeline for our applications because we are a tribunal, and so tribunal decisions sometimes take longer. However, we've adopted a 90 business day as a matter of a business target. So once you get into that realm of a notice of intent or an application, you're dealing with a statutory decision maker in the circumstance of a notice of intent, or you're dealing with the commissioners when it comes to the applications. And so the things that these decision makers are going to put their mind to when they're evaluating whether or not to approve some fill or to approve a type of house are things like size and siting. So for example, they may consider whether or not the size of the house meets the total floor area that's permitted, or if it exceeds that, is the extra total floor area or is the additional residence related to a farm use? Again, going back to the commission's mandate to encourage farming, to make priority agriculture the priority use. They're also going to consider siting, which is a really big deal to the commission, because they want to know that does this house or does this fill take away any farmable area? So we're trying to preserve as much agricultural land as we can in the ALR, and even the siting of houses and fill can unnecessarily fragment areas of farmland, making them unusable or an awkward size for different types of agriculture. Which sort of leads to the next point is, does the siting of that house or that fill make farming more difficult? And then lastly, sort of rounding it out is, will this housing make the land less affordable or less appealing to farmers? Will somebody be able to afford this in future if they want to farm that land, but can't afford it because the housing on it pushes it out of their reach? So now I'm going to pass it over to Katerina, and she's going to take you through some scenarios when you might need to make a notice of intent.
Thank you, Liz. Can you advance the slide? So in the first scenario, if the fill placement area for a principal residence is greater than 1,000 square meters, an ALC authorization is required, as Liz mentioned. It's important to note that the fill placement area for a residence includes its associated driveway. So if there's a long driveway leading to the back of the property, this will likely put you over the 1,000 square meter fill placement threshold. Through the NOI process, decision makers such as myself will look at siting and potential impacts to farmable land. So if we determine that this fill placement area is not well situated on the property, it will likely be refused unless there is a reason for the siting, such as for some topographic challenges or maybe some other reasonable justification, and that information has actually been provided in the NOI submission. So if it's refused, it may be directed to application, which again does not guarantee an approval, but I would say in most cases, it might be better to revise the siting so that it fits within that 1,000 square meter fill placement area footprint and at the same time reduces the impact to farmable land. So just pointing you to the drawing on the right, this kind of shows how poor siting impacts agriculture. The siting or the driveway is bisecting the property, which can have a whole host of issues for agricultural production. And next slide, I'll just show you an actual example of how siting can impact future farmability of a property. So the principal residence in this case was placed in the middle of the property with a long driveway that curves around the back of the house. You can see that the siting in this area will have implications for a future landowner who may wish to farm that tree brushed area on the left-hand side of your screen. If they wanted to farm in the future, the current landowner may actually not be farming. So this property has now effectively been cut in half. So it is recommended that residential structures are sited along the frontage of a parcel. This type of siting will likely mean that an NOI is not needed, as this will probably result in a fill area, most likely result in a fill area of less than 1,000 square meters. So that's the exemption that's allowed within our regulations. Moving on to additional residences. Next slide. So an additional residence, so as mentioned, of 90 square meters on parcels 40 hectares or less, or 186 square meters on a parcel greater than 40 hectares, is permitted but requires an NOI for the fill. So again, there is no exemption in the regulation for additional residences for fill. They all need authorization from the ALC through the NOA for fill placement. A reminder that additional residences greater than 90 or 160 square meters cannot be approved through an NOI process, as these exceed the regulated total floor areas. And just a couple examples on the next slide. When it comes to additional residences, clustering of residences, as Liz mentioned, is important. And at the frontage of the property, it is highly recommended to site these at the frontage of the property to reduce those impacts to agricultural land and to speed up the NOI process. This is twofold. So we are seeing, I will say we are seeing a large number of additional residents through the NOI process. They're not clustered with a principal residence. And in the case of the image on the right, this can have significant impact on agricultural production. Most farmers will prefer the field configuration on the left, as it allows for better movement of farm equipment. So when we receive a proposal where structures are not clustered, NOI staff often were reaching out to applicants, recommending that they revise the siting. In a lot of cases, the landowners have applied and have subsequently received approvals. But I just want to emphasize that this definitely slows down the NOI process. So getting siting right the first time is key to a faster approval. So while we're on the topic of additional residents, I just wanted to go over a couple little more examples of some carriage houses. Next slide, please. So carriage houses are permitted in the ALR by resolution of the commission, and if an additional residence is constructed above a garage. I just wanted to emphasize the word garage because there's been a lot of confusion about what this means, and we've seen some very interesting interpretations of garage. So I'm hoping we've clarified that a bit more today. Just a couple more examples in addition to the one Liz provided, that these are consistent with the ALC information bulletin. You'll note that in both of these examples, the floor area of the garage is equal to or less than the floor area of the additional residence located above on the second floor, up to a maximum of 90 or 186, depending on the side of the parcel. In both of these cases, there's actually no internal connection. The one on the left, that there's no internal door on that staircase to the garage, as again, that garage is not intended for use by the additional residents. It's meant for the principal residence. The garages in both these cases are large spaces accessed only by the garage doors, and there's no partitions or rooms on this floor. So I just want to keep I want you to keep these designs in mind when talking to your clients, as many landowners have interpreted the allowance for this garage as a two-story house. This is not the case. Next slide. So we also wanted to discuss, while we have you, some additional accessory residential structures. As we've seen a large uptick in these types of structures in the ALR, with many of them being very large and generally not appropriate in the ALR. So the ALR use regulation only permits a structure other than a residential use that is necessary for a residential use. So unfortunately, within our regulation, there's no definition what a necessary residential use is, and this has caused a lot of confusion. Local government bylaws, on the other hand, have broader definitions of accessory or ancillary uses. So we're hoping, through this guidance document that I'll go into the next slide, we're hoping to kind of, create some kind of understanding of what reasonable accessory uses are. But just a note, NOIs are required to place fill for all accessory structures. Next slide, please. So the ALC does not want to be unreasonable when it comes to building residential accessory structures in the ALR. So we developed this guideline to provide guidance to local government builders, architects, landowners on what the commission considers reasonable accessory structures in the ALR. So this guideline, the Accessory Residential Structures Guideline, was published just a few weeks ago in February 2024. It outlines the types of accessory residential use structures that a statutory decision maker such as myself may consider through the NOI. It outlines design and siting considerations that will be used by the statutory decision when considering an NOI for an accessory residential use structure. Next slide. So the types of reasonable structures identified include personal recreational vehicle storage, residential workshops, household greenhouses, and tool and garden sheds. So there's also design siting guidelines specific to workshops and vehicle storage, because we are by far seeing those as the most common type of accessory residential structure. And it mimics the total floor area for additional residences. So if you're on a parcel that's less than 40 hectares, a maximum total floor area of 90 square meters. For those parcels greater than 40 hectares, it's the maximum total floor area of 186 square meters. They should be single story and again clustered with other residential structures. They shouldn't contain sleeping areas, recreational rooms, gyms, spas, offices, as these should be accommodated for within that principal residence. But I want you to note that these are not hard and fast rules. These are guidelines, and the statutory decision maker will look at each proposal and property individually to determine if the structure is reasonable on that specific property, even if it exceeds these guidelines. Next slide. So just an example, these are also in the guideline of what we consider to be reasonable accessory structures that are likely to be quickly approved through an NOI. And I just want you to note the simplicity of the design of these structures. In contrast, next page, please. Here's an example of an accessory structure that is not consistent with these guidelines. And I believe this was over 200 square meters structure in a very small property, and it was impacting the agricultural land. On the left-hand side of the building, and there was a mezzanine. It contained a few offices. I think there was actually three three-piece bathrooms in this structure, and it appeared to be used as an office space, which, those uses should be located in the residence. So the landowner was directed to redesign to something smaller that is more consistent with the guidelines. But the moral of the story is simple designs are more likely to be approved, whereas large structures with multiple uses are not. Next slide, please. And lastly, I just wanted to quickly take you through the administrative part of submitting an NOI. So an NOI is initiated by landowner or agent through the ALC portal, which comes directly to the ALC. It is checked for completeness, and if it's complete, an acknowledgement letter is sent. This starts a 60-day calendar day countdown. The proposal is then reviewed by staff. If there are questions about the proposal, it will be paused until the landowner agent provides additional information. Then it is unpaused and that 60 calendar day countdown restarts if the staff have asked for additional information. So I want to emphasize we strive to get our decisions out as soon as possible. However, I'm just going to say it, we are slammed right now and have been for the last year. And each of our staff are handling upwards of 30 files at any given time. And there's only 3 of them for the entire province. So they're trying their best to deal with your files, but at the same time, they're dealing with 29 other files. So just please keep that in mind. So once all information has been gathered, the statutory decision maker either approves a proposal and issues an NOI, or it's refused. So I'm just going to pass it back to Liz to describe some of the non-adhering residential use scenarios.
Great. Thanks, Katerina. So I'm going to sort of start to bring this on home near the end of our presentation here. So I'm just going to walk you through some scenarios where you may need to make an application for a NARU or non-adhering residential use application. So for example, if you wanted to make, if a landowner wanted to construct a residence that is greater than 500 square meters, they would be required to submit a non-adhering residential use application. And again, if somebody wanted to do an addition that would push that total floor area over 500, same thing, a NARU application would be required. So typically, I've only seen these types of residences approved in situations there's been a large, typically multi-generational family who all contribute to the farm, and they prefer to live all under one roof as opposed to multiple residences. So those are the scenarios where I've seen this type of thing approved. Not so much in other scenarios where somebody is seeking a large parcel so they could just construct a large house on which to put a residential use. In my experience, the Commission usually approves residences that are marginally exceed the 500 square meters and not those which more than double the 500 square meters. So one situation that we see, it's very common, is what we call a reside and replace application. So this is the circumstance where a landowner may have a home and perhaps the home isn't serving their purposes, if it's just in disrepair or not quite the right size, or it's just aging, and they would like to replace it and build a new residence. So what ends up happening is that as a landowner is constructing their new residence and they want to live in their old residence, there's temporarily 2 homes on the property. And because of that, that triggers an application to the commission for a non-adhering residential use. So the ALC is usually concerned in these cases with the new residence being sited well, as we've talked about before, so that it doesn't take up good land, and ensuring that the old residence is removed and that that area is reclaimed and ideally brought back into agricultural production. So I will say that the ALC usually requires a financial security and a covenant that ensures that the old residence is demolished and that area is reclaimed. And the commission really prefers that the residence is demolished and not decommissioned, because after 50 years of being in the business, the ALC has seen a lot of homes that were promised to be decommissioned and were not decommissioned, or later on were recommissioned either accidentally or on purpose. This is a very common application type. In fact, we even have a streamlined process for this if people meet the siting criteria, minimize impact on the land, and agree to these financial securities and covenants to ensure removal of the old houses. So we do just endeavor to move these through as quickly as possible, because we recognize that this is just part and parcel of houses aging and needing to be replaced in the ALR. So our most popular application that we get in terms of non-adhering residential use is an additional residence that's larger than that 90 or 186 square meters that's permitted outright. The very interesting thing about this is that the ALC legislation is very clear, and it directs the commission to not allow an additional residence unless it is deemed to be necessary for a farm use. So that's a very clear direction in the ALC's legislation that multiple houses need to be related to farming. And in some circumstances, this is extremely straightforward. We see dairy farms and livestock operations where it's very clear that you need multiple people living on the property 24/7, 365 days a year to do that work. And those ones tend to be quite straightforward. And the more detail we get about a farm operation, the easier it is for the commissioners, who are farmers and ranchers themselves, to understand the proposal and the necessity for additional residential farm help on the property. So new additional residences, this can either be a new additional residence, or if somebody wants to construct a new principal residence but retain that old residence instead of demolishing it and keeping it for farm help. So I'm just going to walk you quickly through the application process, because it is quite an extensive process that starts with a landowner and moves through a local government and then eventually arrives at the ALC after the local government reviews it. So the application is submitted online in our portal, either by an applicant or by an agent who's appointed to make the application on behalf of the applicant, the landowner. The application is then moved to the local government where the land is located, and the local government will review that application within the context of their bylaws and their official community plans and see if it's consistent. They may also send it to their Agricultural Advisory Committee, their AAC, or they may send it to the Ministry of Agriculture and Foods, MAF, as referral to get their thoughts on these residential applications in the ALR. And so once the local government has done their review, they will then decide. They have the option either to forward the application to the ALC or refuse to forward the application to the ALC. And if they refuse to forward it, the application stops there and there is no other means of getting that proposal to the ALC. But more often than not, the application is forwarded to the commission. Then that will go to our staff, who will prepare the application. If they need more information, they'll contact you directly, ask that information. If it's a particularly complex housing application, they may try to set up an applicant meeting or do a site visit to better understand the proposal. So again, I always recommend that as much information as possible, photographs, explanation of the need for that residence is extremely helpful to staff and to the decision makers. So once the commissioners have all that information as a tribunal, they will sit down and they will look at that, what is essentially evidence. They will determine the facts and they will make findings on whether to approve or not approve an application. And they will give their reasons for those findings. And those findings and that decision is always delivered in writing. And so that is part of the reason why the application process, once it hits the ALC's desk, can take up to about 90 business days. But again, the simpler the proposal, the quicker things move through. So I just want to wrap things up, so then hopefully we can get to some questions. But these are some of the key takeaways we hope that you get. First is to start early if you know you need to engage with the ALC, and keeping in mind that 60 calendar days for the notice of intent process, 90 business days for the application process, but knowing that they may shift and change a little bit. As much as possible, provide a site plan so we can evaluate that siting that the commission is particularly concerned about, as well as building plans if you have them, so that we can ensure that it's meeting the total floor area definitions or understanding how they exceed that total floor area definition. And then my biggest piece of advice, if anybody was to call me up on the phone and say, what can I tell you? The best piece of advice really is don't overbuild, don't overfill, and site it well. And those are the three key things that are really going to help the commission evaluate and assess that there is a low perceived or actual risk to damaging farmland or using farmland that can otherwise be used for agriculture. And then, as Katerina mentioned, that commission is reasonable and understands that sometimes things don't sort of fit in a nice, neat and tidy box. And so if your proposal doesn't necessarily meet the total floor area definitions or the guidelines, provide a rationale to explain maybe why that house needs to be situated in a different area due to topography, or that siting it somewhere else is actually better for agriculture and uses an area that's not cultivable. So we're open to all of those reasons, but it's just good to put it down and don't make assumptions that the commission is going to understand your property and your specific needs in particular. So with that, I think we will wrap it up there, and I provide you with Katerina and my email. You can email us directly if you have any questions, and we're happy to chat anytime that you have questions about the ALR and housing. So with that, I'll hand it back to Lisa.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Katerina. Just a wealth of information, and I'm really looking forward to this being the start of this partnership moving forward, and hearing from the ALC more regularly. So we'll leave the emails up there, and Samantha will type those into the chat box if you want to copy them as well. And I'll start going through some of these questions from the SGDI team. Why is the ratio for a garage for a 5,000 square foot home so small when most municipalities have an allowance that's similar for homes that are 2,500 to 3,500 square feet?
Sure, I can take a crack at that. So the 42 square meters is what's exempt. If you wanted to have more, if you wanted to have a larger garage, it would just eat into your 500 square meters total floor area. So the 42 square meter is on top of what you get with a 500 square meter. I'm not sure if that answers that question directly.
Well, we can move to the next one. We've got a lot of great questions here too. So Toby would like to know, what is the smallest size of ALR property that allows for homes to be built?
Oh, I think any size really. So the ALC doesn't have a minimum lot size for housing. That would more likely be controlled by local government or just servicing requirements. So there is no minimum parcel size for housing in the ALR.
Rod would like to know, can you have an internal stairway to the upper suite, providing there is no access to the garage under the secondary unit?
Katerina, would you like to cover that one?
Yeah, I think there was an example in the sample design that I had on my slides. It was the one on the left. So yes, you can, as long as there's not an internal connection between that staircase and the garage, but that will be counted towards the total floor area. So just keep that in mind. Whereas if it's external, it's obviously not counted towards your total floor area. So you do lose a little bit of space when you put that staircase in. But yes, it's permitted.
And Katerina, I think this is also part of what you touched on. Sean would like to know, does the gravel topping for a new driveway count as fill?
It does, yeah. So fill technically in our definitions is anything brought into any material brought into the ALR. So it's very broad definitions, but yes, we consider any amount of gravel that's brought into the ALR as fill. And if it doesn't meet one of those exemptions, including the 1,000 square meter exemption for residents, then it meets an NOI. So for a driveway, if that driveway is so yes, if you already have a driveway and you need to bring in more material, it technically meets an NOI.
And Liz, I know you touched on this maybe in talking about the rationale we should be including in our applications. Steve would like to know, will any level of consideration be given for potential allowances to the 1,000 meters squared for pre-existing long driveways, or for areas of the property that are not actually suitable for farming? Many blocks of ALR farmland have both farmable and non-farmable land. If placement of homes or principal homes or accessory homes are placed on those areas, can there not be some allowance made to the total fill area and or total living space?
Okay, there's a bit to unpack there. So I think sort of what I was speaking about in the end is that siting is, as much as possible, be great if everything was sited close to the road, but we understand that sometimes there are areas that if you did that, you'd actually be taking up the farmable area, and it would be better if you push that house back, and what's going to end up happening is you're going to have a longer driveway in order to reach that. So in order to get sort of that exemption from the 1,000 square meters in order to reach your principal residence that perhaps has to be situated somewhere else, that would just go to an NOI, and you would just explain to the notice of intent team through your NOI, this is the rationale for the siting it somewhere else, and then they would assess the fill that way. Now, I feel like there's a few parts to that question, so I don't know if there is the second part to it.
So many blocks of ALR farmland have both farmable and non-farmable. If placement of homes or principal homes are placed on these areas, can there not be some allowance made to the total fill area and or total living space?
So yeah, so I think we've covered for the total fill area. Yes, the commission will take into consideration an alternate location if there is a rationale for it. If you need to place it somewhere else, will they take into consideration more total floor area? Again, if it's more total floor area for principal residence, it has to be because necessity for farm use. And that's really what it comes down to, is larger total floor area has to be necessary for farm use.
Jacob has a question on having two lots in the ALR. One is landlocked and he needs a road or access way to it. Does he need approval from the ALR to access this property?
Katerina, we've seen these situations before, but yeah. I think Katerina's probably dealt with it on her team.
Yeah, I mean, it is an NOI. We often get these, so it's it's basically you're either building a driveway or a farm access road, depending on what you're planning on doing on that property. So yeah, that's just a simple notice of intent. I would recommend that any roads, driveways, or farm access roads, if possible, be located along the boundary of the property, just to reduce the impact to the ag land. So often we see people kind of placing them, maybe not in the middle, but to the side of the property, and often we'll come back and say, hey, can you just put it along the boundary of the property? So that's why we're really emphasizing that. But yeah, we see these often, and they're generally not an issue.
Steve would like to know, if there are only 3 staff doing review of ALC applications, is there intention of expanding the staffing to help manage and shorten the approval process?
Liz, do you want to take this as a director?
Sure, always. Yes, we would love to have more staff. It's not a matter of not wanting to hire more people, but we are not the masters of our own budget. And whether it's on the NOI side or on the application side, there really is a discrepancy in the ratio of staff to applications. After 50 some odd years at the ALC, the application side, we do somewhere between 300 and 400 decisions a year. The notice of intent team gets around 300 notices of intent per year, and it's a lot of work. So if there was any way that we would be master of our own budget, we would address that immediately, if not sooner.
Katerina, would radon rock brought into the internal footprint of the primary building count toward the 1,000 meter squared allowance?
That's the first time I've heard that question. As long as it's in that fill footprint area and it's less than 1,000, it would be exempt. But if the fill footprint area is greater than that, then it wouldn't require an NOI. So it would be included as fill along with structural fill. So it's really just related to that fill placement area.
Another fill question from Sean. If gravel is on my property and I use it for the driveway, not brought in from elsewhere, does that still count? Does light grading around the home count as fill area, aka leveling out an area without bringing in outside fill?
Yeah, so our legislation is triggered the minute you bring it onto the property. So whether or not something has already been brought onto the property, I can't say for certain because it could be that that material was brought in without authorization. But and that could potentially become a compliance and enforcement issue, but that would really depend on the volume. If it's a small volume, I don't think that we would see it as a big deal, but generally anything that's brought from outside of the property onto the property is considered fill, and then you have to look at those exemptions under section 35 of our regulation.
I'll maybe just add to that, that if you have native fill on your own property and you're just moving it around, that doesn't require anything from the ALC. And we know that some farms and ranches have access to some of their own gravel from their own property. And again, that doesn't require anything if you're just moving it around your own property.
There is one exemption for farm roads. So if you have a constructed farm road, you are allowed, oh gosh, what is it, 50 cubic meters per 100 meters to just kind of fix up the road on an annual basis. But there's no exemptions for driveways, but there are for farm roads.
We have a couple questions kind of dealing with the assessment of ALR land around the province, and are there any points where some farmlands will be reconsidered, etc., for housing purposes?
Oh, for housing purposes. Good question. So we actually have processes outside of Katerina and this process that we're talking about today. So we have what are called regional planners, and what they do is they work with local governments. And now the legislation has been changed so that only a local government can apply to the ALC to have land removed from the ALR. And I assume by the question, they're probably asking about removing land, excluding land from the ALR for housing development. So it's local governments that have to put forward a rationale to the commission to exclude land in their community to meet some sort of planning exercise that they're doing. The commission itself is not looking to exclude land for housing. Again, the commission's mandate is quite narrow, which is the preservation of agricultural land and encouraging farming. There are other ministries who have that mandate, and so they would most likely approach the ALC. But again, no matter what, the ALC maintains its mandate. And I know there's been a lot of new changes and new introduction of housing statutes in late 2023 and early 2024, such as like the Housing Supply Act and other things like that. And maybe just a point to clarify that the ALC Act has primacy over those acts. So whatever those acts are, they do not compel the ALC to make any changes to do sweeping changes for housing.
What is the process for builder concerns with ALC in relation to building permits?
I think maybe we might need a little more explanation. We don't do building permits. So is there, I'm not exactly sure what the question is.
I think if builders are having individual issues, can they reach out to you? And I believe when we talked yesterday, you said our members can reach out to you if they have questions around their applications or timelines. Is that possible?
Yes. If the question is, who can we talk to at the ALC if we want to elevate something? Katerina and I are probably your people. So our contact information is there. It's also on the website. Unlike a lot of other government bodies, all of our direct emails and phone numbers are on our contact page. So if you have questions or concerns about an application that you've submitted, contact me. If you have questions or concerns about a notice of intent, contact Katerina.
Are there changes to regulations that will impact construction of homes for families on ALR? And how do we stay up to date on current policies and upcoming changes?
So there are no contemplated changes to the regulation. As I mentioned earlier in our presentation, the ALC does not have control in creating or changing its act or regulations. And I'm just not aware that there are going to be any changes to it. But in terms of, sorry, can you just repeat the second part of the question, Lisa? Because there's two, it was a great
how do we stay up to date on policies and any upcoming changes?
Yeah, and I think Lisa and I had a good chat about this yesterday. So I have found out CHBA does a newsletter, and we at the ALC do an information bulletin. So I think what we've talked about is that as we do information bulletins, which often go out to local governments, and you can subscribe as well, is that we're going to send that to CHBA and put them on our mailing list. And then Lisa and her team can then send it out by way of whatever communications you have. And any of you are able to subscribe to our information updates as well. Some may be about housing, some may be about other things, but you'd be kept apprised of all changes that are sort of going on that we communicate in the ALR.
Graham would like to know, does the ALC have any regulation on the application of legal suites within a primary residence other than the aforementioned size limits?
Sorry, can you repeat that question? I'm trying to figure out how I would like to answer that.
Does the ALC have any regulation on the application of legal suites within a primary residence other than the aforementioned size limits?
No, typically it's local governments that sort of govern. We just say you may have a suite. The local government might restrict the size or prohibit it completely, but the ALC generally just says it's allowed. The only thing that maybe just to mention there is that the ALC does not contemplate duplexes. So if somebody was contemplating doing a suite, secondary suite that's going to be equal to the size of the principal and essentially make a duplex, the Act and regulations don't contemplate duplexes.
So one more question. Are there opportunities for ALR land to be used for purposes like housing construction workers when responding to a crisis, such as the fires we saw in the interior last summer?
I would say that it's not a general thing that is in our Act and regulation, but we have come across this situation before, whether it's been with wildfires or like water bomber pilots needing a place to stay or firefighters. It still does require an application because we as staff cannot exempt people from the legislation and the law. But that being said, we do understand that there are potential emergencies. And so we usually work with whichever local government that needs to come through to get them to encourage them to expedite that application. And then once it hits our desk, we are ready and waiting for it. And then we expedite it as well. So we've had that happen in a few circumstances. So hopefully we don't have emergencies that need that, but if we do, we will react.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz and Katarina, for your time today. I'm really excited to have the opportunity for ALC and CHBA BC to work more closely together in the future. And I'm just very thankful for your time. It's really positive to make this connection and know that we can work together and collaborate moving forward. Yeah, thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, and thank you for setting this up, and thank you to your members for coming today. And again, I just reiterate, feel free to reach out to us, and looking forward to continuing on and keeping the communication going between our two organizations.
Absolutely. So like we've said in the chat there, the recording of this presentation will be sent to you, as well as the bulletins and details that Katarina and Liz have touched on today. And hopefully this is the first of many webinars that we're doing like this. So thank you, Liz. Thank you, Katarina. And thanks everyone for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.